Hey there folks, Wrel here. Today we're going to be doing a general overview of the differences between aiming down sights and hip firing, and talk about recoil and compensating for it as well. The point of this video will be to arm both new players and veterans with some knowledge that you may or may not have known, or even cared to know, so that you can use it to your advantage in game. We'll start with some of the basic stuff, and then we'll work into the more interesting bits. So aiming down sights, or ADS, is when you've got your gun raised and you're looking down the sights or down the scope. When you aren't ADS, you're essentially firing from the hip, or hip firing. The accuracy of each weapon is different depending on whether or not you're aiming down sights. In almost all cases, your weapons will have better accuracy while you ADS. This accuracy statistic is what we call your cone of fire, which, from the hip, is shown between your crosshairs, and your bullets will travel to any point within those bounds. When aiming down sights, the crosshairs will shrink and then disappear, being replaced by whichever optic you have equipped, but your bullets will still observe a cone of fire even though you can't see it. As you fire your weapon, your cone of fire expands with each shot, and the weapon becomes less accurate. The amount that your cone of fire expands is based on a value called bloom. Cone of fire statistics are available to you when you look at the weapon in your loadout screen, and they aren't laid out in the clearest manner, but you can still see what does what. The values are based on your character's stance, so whether you're crouching or standing, and aiming down sights or hip firing. All of these values are measured in degrees, but you really just need to know which ones are important and how to compare them. If you look at the Reaper DMR for the new conglomerate, you'll see that it has a 0 standing aim down sights cone of fire. This means that if you're standing still, the first shot will always go exactly where you want it to, with no room for error beyond the bullet drop. However, the most important values to pay attention to here are generally your moving cone of fire values. In most cases, when you're trying to shoot at a target, you are also moving left or right to throw off the enemy's aim. This is called strafing or side strafing. If you aren't constantly side strafing, then chances are that you're going to be dying a lot more than you have to be. So your moving cone of fire is important, and how much your weapon blooms is also important. But the difference between aim down sights cone of fire and hip fire cone of fire really comes down to what you're going to be using the weapon for. A smaller hip fire cone of fire means more accuracy from the hip, which is better suited to close quarter situations, while a smaller aim down sights cone of fire means that the weapon is more accurate when you're aiming down sights. It's pretty simple in that respect. It's worth noting that if you start firing from the hip and then later aim down sights midstream, the cone of fire does get reduced, but it does not get reset. But if you do let off the trigger for a moment, the cone of fire will then shrink down, and you'll be able to make use of the standard aim down sights cone of fire as usual. So in short, it's not a great idea to start firing from the hip and then transition into aiming down sights without letting off the trigger. It works the same way for going from aim down sights to hip fire, but that's generally a bad idea, as the cone of fire will only get bigger once you back out of the scope. If you want to back out of the scope in the middle of firing, you'd likely be doing it to gain a movement speed advantage. And speaking of, all weapons will lower your movement speed while aiming down sights. How much or how little your movement speed is reduced depends on the weapon's ADS Movement Speed Multiplier. So when you fire from the hip, you move the fastest, at 100% of your walking or your strafing speed, depending on whether you're moving forward or left, right, or backwards. Your forward walking speed is 4 meters per second, while your strafing speed is 3 meters per second. Most weapons will slow you down by an additional 50% while aiming down sights, and if you turn on your heavy assault shield, it's going to slow you by another 20%. There are, however, a handful of weapons that will only slow you by 25% while aiming down sights. All pistols, shotguns, and SMGs, as well as some specific weapons, offer you this 0.75 times ADS Movement Speed Multiplier, and I've listed all the weapons in the video description below. As you can tell by the numbers on the screen, the difference between 0.75 times ADS and 0.5 times ADS is pretty significant in regards to how quickly you can move while aiming down sights. And faster movement means that the enemy has to adjust their aim more, which means the potential for less shots to hit you. This movement speed value is not listed in the in-game statistics, which is why we are linking them in the video description below, but in my opinion it should be, because it's a pretty important factor in how a weapon handles. Other values not listed in the in-game statistics have to do with your recoil patterns. Recoil is basically how much and in which direction the gun kicks after each shot. I'm not going to go into the technical details on this because it would make for a much longer video than this needs to be. Instead, I'm going to link Iridar's guide in the video description, which breaks it all down nicely. I highly suggest you give it a look if you have an interest. The easiest way to get a feel for the weapon's recoil pattern is to go into the VR training room, equip a weapon you're interested in using, and then you try to make it dance for you. If you look at a wall and then you just spray it without touching the mouse, you'll see which direction the weapon is most likely to kick. All weapons shake left and right after each shot, but they also have a pattern associated with them. Some weapons kick straight up, and other weapons angle off to the left or the right. Once you know which direction the weapon is most likely to pull, you'll just need to drag your mouse in the opposite direction while you're firing. This is recoil compensation in a nutshell. How hard you have to drag down on the mouse and how tight your groupings are going to be will depend on the weapon and your sensitivity settings, but this basic practice is essential for handling weapons in PlanetSide 2. On top of the weapon's recoil pattern, it's important to know that your first shot also has some bonus recoil associated with it. Some weapons are going to kick a lot more on your first shot, and some are going to be barely noticeable, but knowing how much your first shot kicks will help you figure out which compensation technique works best for you. A couple of ways to compensate for recoil can be thought of as either neck to head or head down. For a neck to head recoil pattern, you're basically starting your volley at either the neck or the chest, depending on the range, and then you're letting your subsequent shots kick into the head area as you drag down on the mouse to compensate. This technique is useful for weapons with high first shot recoil, as if you start from the head, it will cause your subsequent shots to miss unless you drag down really hard on the mouse. For weapons with lower first shot recoil, starting at the head is completely fine, and that's what I'm referring to by head down, just compensating for the recoil as normal instead of doing so on the second shot. You can also pre-compensate for recoil by starting to drag down on the mouse before you pull on the trigger. These methods are actually pretty similar when you boil them down, and the actions happen so quickly that you probably wouldn't notice a difference on screen either way, so just take into consideration as more of a mindset than anything else. Neck to head or head down. Remember that this will depend a lot on the type of weapon and even more on the ranges at which you're fighting. Regardless of which compensation technique you use though, one thing to always keep in mind is the power of letting off the trigger. When you fire off a burst of shots, just letting off the trigger will return your weapon to center as well as reduce your weapon's cone of fire. This is not a recoil compensation method per se, but it is an important part of controlling your accuracy on top of compensating for recoil. Bursting becomes more essential the further away your target is from you, but keep in mind that each time you start firing a volley, you are going to incur that same first shot recoil that we talked about earlier. This may all seem pretty basic to a lot of you who normally watch the channel, but even so, I hope that you were able to glean something useful out of it. If this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel, and if you have any thoughts or questions regarding some of these fundamentals, go ahead and leave those in the comments section down below. Thanks very much, folks. Wrel signing off.